Here's what you missed this week on The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We're coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, good old Iowa, between two rivers, here on Iowa Catholic Radio. So wonderful to have you with us. But it is, of course, not 21 years yet, but we got done with the 20th year of Iowa Catholic Radio. That means we're coming up on 10 years of us. We want to say thank you to Imogene Ingredients for making the show possible by underwriting it, and thank you for Iowa Catholic Radio for having us along for at least half of its life. I'm Bo Bonner. You might know me from the Catholic Morning Show, among other things, but how do people know you?
So I am down at Mercy College of Health Sciences, where I work with our general education professors in the math, science, English classes at the college.
Absolutely wonderful. How was the break? I know break is in scare quotes for everyone, but I know especially for you, you have plenty to do over the break when it comes to college.
Yeah, the break went okay. For myself and the family, we were able to step away for about 9 days, which was nice. To try to really set aside time to celebrate Christmas well.
Yeah, we were driving around everywhere for sure. And, again, people doing all sorts of stuff for the new year, and that's what we were going to try to do for our show, is not make bold predictions about 2026, but try to think through what seems to be on the horizon when it comes to issues affecting the church and the world that have to do with Catholic social teaching. 2025, a great year in many ways for the show, for Iowa Catholic Radio. Big changes for Bud and I and all of you as well, I'm sure. So looking forward to see what 2026 might have in store by, as it were, surveying the seeds that are sprouting here early in January. We hope everybody had a beautiful Christmas and continuing to celebrate the year. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr will be back right after this. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Bud, as you've probably noticed, and anyone else, the calendar's changed. No one writes checks anymore, or not very many, so we don't have that telltale sign where you accidentally write down the incorrect date in a check. But maybe you've sent off an email or perhaps entered something to the system, tempted to type that 5 when it's the 6, but that means we're halfway over with a new decade, which also seems weird.
Yeah.
But, of course, time is not arbitrary, but, it's not like everybody, nature waits for the calendar to flip. However, in the course of human events, it really does seem like December allows us to pause and look back, and January brings to mind things to look forward. And I think a lot of momentous things seem to be lining up in 2026. An easy one to think through, right? Pope Leo XIV just closed the holy doors. So last year was the Jubilee Year of Hope, and just that alone, thinking about the Jubilee Year of Hope being started by Pope Francis, ending with Pope Leo XIV, calls to mind already a pivot point that is getting ready to start in earnest with the Church. The first year fully with Pope Leo XIV. He's already called a consistory of cardinals. So I think maybe that is one thing to look forward to, is what does it look like having the Church under the helm, fully under Leo XIV, as it were? Yeah,
so one thing that's really struck me about Pope Leo's personality, I think I've mentioned this on a previous episode, is he seems really careful and deliberate as a decision maker. So I think those first several months in 2025, he was really getting his bearings. And if you talk to, or I haven't personally talked to anyone, but if you read or listen to folks who are close to him, apparently he's a strong listener, and that's a key part of his sort of pastoral sensibilities. So I think this year we'll get a much stronger sense of the direction of things. I'm curious to see how things go. Early on, I think it might be underway or just getting underway. There's a consistory of cardinals, and so there are going to be some key discussions there. I think liturgical topics are on the table. They're reading together documents of Vatican II. They should have invited me to the gathering, Bo. I've had the opportunity to give some Vatican II talks here in Des Moines. So if Pope Leo or another one of the cardinals is listening today,
right,
I still can arrange some travel details to Rome I may need some financial help, but I'm willing to get out.
You're willing to make that sacrifice. We had the whole series last year on reading the Vatican II documents through media and technology. So, just sitting there being at service of the church, bud.
Yeah.
The interesting thing, right, when it comes to, just again, focusing on the holy doors, so they close, right? That's part of like holy years of Jubilee year. They open and close, etc. So usually that's in 25-year segments. Looking forward, though, we're going to have one that happens earlier because in 2033, the 2,000-year anniversary of the resurrection, Pope Leo XIV is already talking about announcing a holy year that year. And already he seems to be closing in and very much circling the idea of working towards real Christian unity between the East and West. And he's already shown that with the anniversary for Nicaea that came up. But this sort of eyes on the prize of a real way to celebrate together in 2033 seems very near and dear to Pope Leo XIV's heart, which gets back to unity. Unity, of course, not being possible without peace. I think those two are the elements not only within the church, like how do we become a more unified church? How do we live in peace, right, which is the tranquility of order, not just stuff not happening. But, of course, that also, I think, can lead us into definitively talking about world events here as well.
Yeah, I think those East-West relations are going to become increasingly important under this pontificate, and for good reason. It's funny, Bo, because this has been a topic of conversation in my household. My kids have some friends now who are Eastern Orthodox, and, of course, many listeners know of Father Bruce Reby, who started a Byzantine community here in Des Moines. And it's for my children, as they learn about some of these differences, like in their schooling, they're trying to make sense of, how do Orthodox sit differently in relation to Catholics than like Protestant relatives they have. And, they hear things like, well, Orthodoxy has preserved apostolic succession. They have a priesthood. Christ is sacramentally present in their celebration of the Eucharist. And then they sort of don't understand why there's division there. And so I'm glad that Pope Leo has made this a pastoral priority. I think the anniversary of Nicaea is huge. But for me, when you think about what's happening around the world, and not only sort of like when I think about just specific people in my life who I know who are part of different communities, but thinking about the church around the world, when especially with Orthodox, because of some historical accidents, you have members of that body who are facing, challenging political situations, sometimes overt persecution. And that's where I think the search for unity with the Orthodox is significant, not only at the level of like, well, there's a priesthood here and the sacraments are available. And so like that sort of division is, I think, felt more acutely, but it's a sort of like active concern for members of the body of Christ who are facing challenging situations and learning to live in solidarity with those persons. Well,
I think the hope, right, is there's been multiple attempts, of course, at unity throughout history. That's one thing people should not take lightly. I think sometimes we paper over the multiple attempts that actually were made towards unification. And when it comes to something like St. Andrew of Crete mission, of the Byzantine Ruthenians, Catholics here, Father Bruce Reby, like you're talking about, those were all came about precisely because of attempts at unity. So there was unity made with certain communities. Widespread unity escaped us. It seemed to slip through our fingers a few times. All that said, there is a real way to say in the ancient world. It was really kind of hard, I think, well, let me say more in the medieval world. In the medieval world into the early modern world, it was kind of difficult to understand unity without a sort of expectation of Latinization or a more standardization. That's just kind of like the way the world worked and the cookie crumbled and everything like that. But one of the benefits, maybe, of God asking the East and West to be patient about this is I think there's a lot more under-the-belt history in the Catholic Church particularly, but just in our understandings as well, of where we can say we can have diversity and unity in a real way and not think that one of the demands of the East-West division being closed is a sort of synchronization or a sort of papering over of differences. And I think that it is something that is much more aware, as it were, in the conscience both of the Orthodox and the Catholics about imagining ways to talk about how unity is real without complete synchronization. And I think it's your children's observation that make that the case.
Yeah.
That they say, well, we don't really even understand why we're separated. If the children understand that, then maybe it's time for the adults to do something about it as well. But, political situations, political realities have certainly changed. And so I'm hoping that that's something that 2026 and beyond has in store for us to be able not only to talk about it at the academic level or even the proposal level, but there actually really starts to be structural ways that East and West start to talk fruitfully.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with someone who teaches at the college and is Orthodox, and he was pointing out, this is fascinating to consider. When we think about the split between East and West, because of how we learn history, we think there's this like one precise moment where there's a clear division. So, our kids learn the date 1054 where this schism took place. As this professor was saying, I think it's really true. There were Christians for many decades and even centuries after that who didn't realize there was a split.
Right.
They're living in their circumstances with the world in front of them. And for them, there's like the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That doesn't minimize some of the differences that have emerged. I think the history after that really hit some turbulence that there are factors that make these conversations challenging as well. But recognizing that unity really is possible, and there's a lot that's shared at a deep level. For myself, I feel kind of blessed. We've mentioned on the show that we studied at Duke. Duke did a pretty good job of exposing us to Eastern theology. So we read great theologians like Alexander Schmemann. And for myself, as I kind of, not only more recent Orthodox theologians, but getting into church fathers who were in the East, you sort of like learn a cadence and a language of theology with deep roots that it's not at odds with like Roman Catholicism, but it sometimes has different emphases. And this is where like we could have a whole interesting conversation about development of doctrine. But as I've studied Christian history, and maybe you'd push back a little bit on this idea, I think sometimes the debates that we've had. So if you think about the debates that arose after Protestantism emerged, they sort of set the framework in a certain way. Like they set the terms of the debate. And sometimes we get locked into, so like we were correcting Protestant errors, which was important, but that gave a whole tenor to the conversation, and rooting ourselves back in sort of an Eastern approach where like with salvation, you have an emphasis on ideas like theosis and like that sin is a kind of sickness that God heals us from. Those can be kind of helpful correctives or reminders from the East.
Yeah, and I think similarly, when you get some of the most structural, difficult arguments that have to do with, for instance, the papacy, it is the case that the East and West simply lived different lives through most of history politically. So Eastern Orthodoxy within the empire from Constantinople, and then the sort of difficulties they had with the rise of the Islamic caliphates and things like this, very different than the sort of internal pressures that the Pope in Rome had fighting the birth of sort of like the nation state, right? Like, so in many ways, and I think sometimes people in the West don't realize this, the West was far more pagan and converting pagans in a much grander way for a long time. The papacy sort of rising in power was what you did with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The East really didn't have a dark age, and I use that with big square quotes, of the same degree as what happens in the West. And so this sort of entanglement of the church being the sort of bedrock for civilization for a long time, and then having to navigate the various Christianized pagan groups that more and more want power with kings into, of course, what we now understand as like modern nation statehood and its challenge to the church. So papal supremacy, of course, really has to do with those specific issues and dealing with that, which Eastern Orthodoxy's thing was very different, right? And I'm not trying to say that the emperors and the bishops had an easy time in the East. They had their own sort of conversation as well. All this is to say, Bud, that I think you start to see in the modern world a few things begin to happen. The scholars got together and began to research and say, okay, well, this really was what was going on. They got to understand and recognize maybe that Many of the conversations are talking past each other, but not really as against each other as it seems. We've also got past maybe the romantic period where sometimes people act like look to the other side as the thing that would solve all the problems. I know that sometimes no one ever acts like the Eastern theologians looked west, but it's clearly the case. You saw that's why the Russian Catholic Church exists, for instance. So hopefully these sort of initial forays that we had to get over, right? Like academically, have theologians really set the scene. Get through the puppy love reintroduction of each other's theology, and now we can get down to the business of saying what would unity concretely look like, precisely like you said, because now the social pressures of modernity, of the different persecutions going on in the world of different parts of the church, East and West, begin to ask us to think in a more unified way, rather than in a way that was that the political situation and the social situation were so divided.
Yeah, and talking about this topic, it reminds me of how difficult the Holy Father's job must be sometimes. And I know for myself and my own practice of the faith that I often have this kind of like tunnel vision with respect to what's closest to me. So I'm thinking about my parish life. Of course, these are good concerns. Like this is a sort of subsidiarity. But what's going on at church? Who's my pastor? Maybe like how's the liturgy being celebrated in my context? And even sort of things like the outreach of the church to different parts of the community and things like that. The Pope is the pastor of an amazingly diverse global communion. We talked about this when this past year, we had the privilege of tackling we did our series on Vatican II through the lens of technology and emerging technologies. And we said, sometimes when we read even those documents, we sort of refract them through our own pet topics. Like these are my concerns. This must have been what the bishops were addressing. And you and I didn't try to get too like sophisticated or hoity-toity about it, but just reminding folks like the bishops there at the council. So if you think about something like the document on religious liberty, of course, those bishops who were coming from different parts of the world where they were under like a communist regime, the way that they were thinking about that topic brought those concerns to the table. And with the Pope, I mean, imagine being the pastor of a church where, yeah, you've got members of the body of Christ here in Des Moines, Iowa, with all that's going on here, but also in Palestine and Venezuela and Iran. And you have to be able to be cognizant of those different contexts, but also, there are times when the Holy Father or when the bishops in college try to address a topic that's of concern for the entire church. And that's got to be an amazingly sort of complex thing to do. Yeah,
you kind of have like two things happening at once, especially the modern papacy where it's like, hey, every day, Pope, can we get a quip from you? Like in your Angelus for the week, when you're running around, they're asking you a question as, the press and things like this. So on one hand, you are a world player. You're in dealing with world affairs. It already seems that Leo XIV, for instance, has a sort of, I don't want to say knack for diplomacy as if like someone else was deficient, but I do think because of the positions he's had, he kind of has his pulse on diplomacy in a way that maybe Pope Francis, for instance, or Benedict XVI didn't. And so there's very worldly, this moment affairs you are asked to think about and comment. And also, by the way, you have all of this massive history to think through, like Nicaea's anniversary, 2033. But then also you are asked to talk about the big things, right? The eternal things, the things that never change. And I always feel like I barely can go through life switching gears between like, oh, I'm talking on the radio about theology. Oh, I need to make sure a bill is paid. That can, make me want to take a nap for 5 years, bud. So the Pope doing that for the worldwide church is hard to fathom.
Yeah, and I feel like there are times where there's actually a certain kind of prudence to silence or patience. This has got to be hard to navigate, but you think about some of the most contentious conflicts throughout the world, and the Holy Father, certainly Pope Leo XIV, we've seen during the early part of his pontificate, he wants to challenge Christians to be thinking about the kingdom of God and being a people of peace, like blessed are the peacemakers, and going about that task in every facet of life. And when he addresses any sort of specific locale in the world, there's always the temptation or there's always the possibility that as folks hear that, it's going to sound sometimes like he might be choosing teams. I draw an analogy to life at the college. So at Mercy College of Health Sciences, we have our allied health programs, and then nursing is our biggest program. I'm in charge of liberal arts and sciences. And each one of those groups, we bring certain concerns to the table, and the concerns that are most pressing for us tend to be the ones that we think are the most urgent for everyone. When we have conversations with the president of the college, we want him to have the same sort of urgency about the things that matter most to us. But, naturally in his role, he's balancing different facets of the college. And that's where, I think, I don't want to bite off something that's too big to chew, but even looking back to like World War II.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking of.
Historically, folks have said, did Pius XII handle that situation correctly? Could he have been more vocally critical of the Nazis? And this is not to make a definitive judgment on today's show, but I know one concerns of his is that if I'm full-throated in my condemnations in this situation, it could lead concretely to the death of more Jews or others who are being killed by the Nazis. And so, he had to kind of step back and reflect. And we do know that he took steps to protect Jews, but he had to step back and say, how do I go about this in such a way that I'm speaking out against the terrible things that are happening, but also not doing it in such a way that actually leads to, greater harm.
Yeah, I mean, and directly, I think we can maybe even talk about this more in the second segment. I was thinking directly of Pius XII and his difficulties when considering what Leo XIV has said about Venezuela so far, obviously in the news, with the United States, absconding with the leader Maduro, and obviously various sides having completely different interpretations of what that means. And I think there were some people straight out who thought the next day Leo XIV would condemn what happened, or he would cheer what happened. And instead, he gave what I think was an incredibly poignant and very on the line that needed to be said description of what's necessary when it comes to the world stage and people praying for Venezuela, about the sovereignty of Venezuela and its people. And people have pointed out that he really seems to be taking his cue from the Venezuelan bishops, who themselves have not made a statement as of yet that I know of. Maybe by the time this airs that they have. But when Pope Leo XIV talked about it the next day, the Venezuelan bishops themselves were on the record in the news saying the situation is too dynamic and happening too fast. It is not for us to speak yet. And they have not been silent. The Venezuelan bishops, for instance, had been very vocal for years about the sins of the regime, what it had done against religion. So these were not like wallflowers who just didn't want to talk. They have said plenty, and they themselves knew at that time said it is now not the time to talk. Too much is happening. And so, Leo XIV, I think, actually interpreted in that light, said, I'm not going to overspeak on for my bishops. I'm not going to trip them up. I'm going to be a subsidiarity. I'm going to lead by seeing what they need and then be able to talk about it. But these are the eternal truths that I can talk about that pertain in every situation, and then proceeded to talk about the needs for peace, the necessity of the good of the people of Venezuela being tantamount to, before anything else, right? Before business concerns, before world economics, what is the good of the people of Venezuela? And so that, I think, is illustrative, right, of what you said about how the Pope has to speak to eternal truths, but not speak too much or speak over people or make things worse by trying to be bold. And yes, what immediately came to mind was Pius XII trying to do the same thing with, in some ways, the atrocities even more well known to him at the time because of the reports that he had. So all that to say, I do think looking forward, we have Leo XIV as a pope who seems to be able to take a measurement of that temperature, because his goal is unity and peace, but also seeing that the hard work of unity and peace is not just being agreeable. It's not just saying, like, let's avoid conflict. when there is conflict, what are you going to do about it? What does it mean to be prophetic about peace and unity, not only in the church, but in the world? And these all seem to be things that are on his mind consistently. And I think that goes from things like that's going to come up with the consistory of cardinals, with things like the liturgy, all the way to world affairs, and dealing with the exigencies that are happening in the here and now. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Bud, we're not trying to do a year of foretelling the future in this episode. We're not trying to make predictions that people should come back and see if we got them wrong, because we obviously will. I do think we're talking about seeds that have been sown that seem like they will come to fruition in some way in the church, or the dealing of the church with the world.
Right.
And so we ended, we had to wrap up to get to break. What do you want to say about what we were ending with in the last segment?
Well, sometimes an episode like this can feel a little bit ad hoc, like our Bo and Bud just trying to land on topics that they're interested in speaking to. But I think going back to sacred scripture and the experience of the people of God throughout time, like, these are important conversations. So when you say, well, we're not necessarily seeking to foretell the future, that gets into the question of the very nature of prophecy. And as many a theologian has pointed out, being prophetic in a biblical understanding is not usually trying to predict what's going to happen around the corner, but it's bringing to bear the truths of the faith on current circumstances. So you go back to the Old Testament and you think about, the people of God being in exile, and there were prophets who instructed them during that time, like, seek the prosperity of the city to which you've been sent, right? And so there was even a question of justice and of, I think, witnessing to the truth in circumstances that were less than ideal. Later in the New Testament, there are some interpretations of Christ and what he was about that are sort of quietist, that, really what Jesus brought to the world were spiritual truths about, I don't know, whatever key it's placed in, like the brotherhood of man. And this is sort of like an interior transformation that takes place, and it bears specifically on that part of life. But from the very beginning, like, you think about the apostles, I think there was a gospel reading recently at a daily mass about Peter being arrested, and the powers that be in that context clearly saw the apostles as infringing on their territory. Mm-hmm. And so as Peter and the other disciples, as they followed Christ and followed his teachings, they inevitably came into conflict with the world. As we were wrapping up that last segment, I was thinking about the fact, I really think practicing patience is such an important part of being a Christian. And what I have in mind there, Bo, is so often in life, like, we get sped up. Mm-hmm. And when you think about things that are happening in the church or things that are happening in the world, a lot of times we want resolutions quickly, or even neat and tidy resolutions. So I think about political debates that spark up, and sometimes we fall quickly into this trap of speaking it in the same language that we hear on, like, cable news or whatever, and we're not rooted in this kind of, like, hopeful expectation of what God is doing and is going to do. And that's tough, because I want problems that are in front of me to be solved quickly. But I think, like, when you think about Israel being in exile, as that's told in the Old Testament, so often, folks fall into the wrong ways of going about things because they seek to resolve something mm-hmm. that really only God can bring about.
Well, this is interesting. So to make this also connecting what we were saying at the very end, so obviously the situation of Venezuela is actually still active in very many ways, right? Like, obviously this is going to be a ripple effect politically that we're going to be hearing about at least for weeks. I mean, again, but sometimes living in the 21st century is to go, oh, this issue that we're talking about, like, we're going to have to deal with it for years, and then it'll be done in a week. Like, remember when there were the Australian fires a few years ago? Yeah. And I'm like, we're going to be talking about this for years because it was so devastating, and then no one talked about it, like, very quickly because the news cycle moves on. I do think we'll probably end up talking about Venezuela for a while because it seems like it's going to have geopolitical ramifications in our neck of the woods for a bit. That's a guess, right? But I'll say this. The event is done. The capture of Madero, it happened. And so what I think is important to your getting at this being patient and bringing to bear the mind of Christ and not just the news cycle view of world events. One of the things that I sort of notice people saying is when Catholics started to bring just war criteria into the question of whether this was illicit or not, which is what you should do if you're an ethicist, right? It is your job to bring to bear the tradition on world events and talk about them. That there was a sort of vibe among some people that this was endless, dorky academic brain noodling, that this was, casting doubt for political reasons. There's a lot of idea that you're trying to apply something and naysay something that either is an obvious good or it already happened, so what are you doing? But one of the things I think is important, prophecy is not only about trying to think about the future. Prophecy is being prophetic about what has happened in order that if it might happen again, someone might do it differently. So in some ways, Bud, talking about the news events that have happened, they can't go into the past and correct something. And that's absolutely the case. And so when you have people whose main jibe at you when you're talking about world events is, well, it's in the past, why are you obsessed with it? It's absolutely true. People can be, nostalgia, all these things like this. But that's usually an easy out to get around what we as humans with rational capacities know is part and parcel of what we do. We evaluate just what happened, Bud, because it's on our mind, and it might be the case that we can do it better the next time.
Right.
And so regardless of what side people came down on this, what I do want to say is I tip my hat to the conversation about just war ethics and whether what the Trump administration did in Venezuela falls within it or not, because Catholics are supposed to do that. That is what Catholic ethicists do. And it wasn't just one side alone who was doing it. From Tobias Winwright, who we both know, Ed Fesser, who no one will ever mistake as sort of like a liberal or something like this. Mm-hmm. People really around the horn came to bat talking about, can we evaluate this by just war principles? And the only people that I thought that they all left and right ganged up on correctly were people who were acting like it was wrong to do that. And like I said, people who maybe even agreed with what happened were quick to say, we as Catholics must evaluate this according to just war principles. It's already in the past, but we should do this publicly in order to evaluate what we would do in the future. And people who are saying, it's not your right to do so, or that you shouldn't, what about the fact that there were people in Venezuela who were obviously oppressed by a horrible regime, all this saying, you guys are just talking, that seems to miss the point. The point is Catholics should take the time to apply their principles to events that happen. So then the next time they came back, even if we did it right this time, which, again, I'm on record as saying I don't think we did according to just worth principle, but even if we did, the idea would be, could we have done it more in keeping with the principle next time? To try to shut down that conversation, and it's almost always for political reasons that people are shutting down Catholics trying to apply their ethical theories to modern events, is to undermine precisely what you were just saying about having the mind of Christ and being prophetic. It's not just about telling the future. It's about bringing what the church's intellectual tradition has to bear on the issues of today. And like I said, very different groups from very different parts of the quote-unquote theological and political spectrum did their role when they started to ask those questions about just war. And I was actually proud to see that because that's ethics is the thing that I've trained in.
Well, one of the central theme of this show is Catholic social teaching, so it's something we've talked about a lot. And a particular frustration of mine is, so if someone in your community or a close friend, Catholic, started to question something like the divinity of Christ or the virgin birth, you would, of course, feel defensive and hopefully correct error, charitably, of course, but take the time to do that sort of thing. Even when it comes to certain moral issues. So I know we've got a really strong pro-life Catholic community here in Iowa. That's amazing. We properly consider it problematic if folks say, I'm Catholic and I depart in this respect. We have to be that way about the totality of what the church teaches. I'm going to pick on someone by name. I feel like this is justified in doing so, but there's a writer out there, John Zmirak, and he says, well, when it comes to Catholic social teaching, this is sort of adiaphora, meaning like you can take it or leave it. The church's proper sphere of influence is matters of faith. And so he sets aside what the church has said about social justice and other questions. Now, we have to be properly nuanced here, Bo. Like, for instance, I've mentioned the divinity of Christ. That's a creedal confession that we make. And there's really not wiggle room in the sense that you can explain or seek to understand that in different ways, but
you're not making an application.
A core truth that's negotiable.
You're stating the case.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
This is good. There's not really wiggle room. I don't want to use that terminology with Catholic social teaching either, but there's prudential questions in terms of like, here's the truths and the principles that we're working with. How do they apply in this situation? And as we know, for years and decades, like there have a lot of times been heat around those conversations because folks are taking truths and they're trying to understand them in contexts that are quite complicated. All that being said, though, I just think it's wrong-headed. And like you're saying, we're kind of misunderstanding our vocation as Catholics if we say like, well, it's complicated, therefore we can punt.
Yeah.
Or if you turn to Catholic ethicists and say, like, really, why are you wasting time talking about this? Or we don't have to listen to what you have to say. I do think, so, you know, I've shared numerous times on the show that I've studied and written quite a bit on John Henry Newman. After the First Vatican Council, which treated infallibility, there was an English writer who said, well, Catholics can no longer be trusted because their pope could basically require treasonous acts of them. Mm-hmm. And that's where Newman properly drew a distinction between what the church teaches like philosophically and the application of those ideas. And so he said, look, we're always all going to be faced with specific questions. You know, for instance, if your country gets drawn into a war and there's a question about whether it's just, Catholics in conscience have to wrestle with that. But the church would be usurping the conscience of Christians if it said, in this specific instance, this is what you have to do. Like with a level of specificity that's not warranted by what the church teaches.
Right. And I mean, because, yeah, exactly, because this is the application of principles. This gets back to what we were saying in the first segment about being the Pope and having to take eternal truths to things on the ground, but not overspeak them. The church can't be like, you're going to join the 5th Infantry, and you're always going to shoot at the person four people to your left, or something that they couldn't know. Right.
It's unfeasible anyways.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so when it comes to thinking about the applications of, for instance, just war, but most Catholic social principles, it would be infeasible, impossible to say when X or Y bill comes up, grant is offered, etc., you must do this, this, and this. This is why there can be reasonable, actual disagreement, and we're not being wishy-washy about how you implement the principles. But you also can't say that to get out of implementing the principles. I was talking with Tom Chapman, who is Iowa Catholic Conference, represents the bishops to the Iowa legislature, things like this. And, you know, he was pointing this out that with the Plan B pill, or what, you know, the abortion on demand that people are getting through the mail. He goes, of course, we would outlaw it completely if we were in charge. But as we're not, it's still our responsibility to go, we need to require a law that at least makes it that people have medical care if they're going to take these pills because they have side effects. There's people who've died from it and things like this. And but I think that that's something that people have, like when you talk about the difficulties and the intricacies, this is what we're getting at is, of course, the bishops would say, yes, please outlaw these medicines. Well, at least in their use, right? I should say, outlaw the abortion pill. But if you're not going to do that, at least don't leave it where like kids are dying in bathrooms because they got mail order abortion pills that like made them go into a medical emergency. So in a similar way, sure, like we don't have a Catholic president. And any Catholic president that we had doesn't feel like they can, just start legislating according to the catechism, quote unquote, whatever that might mean.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that we don't have responsibilities to say, this is the way it should be. And even in the conduct you've chosen to do, this is the way closest to what we know is the right way, et cetera, things like that.
Well, it's important to take seriously the totality of what the church teaches, and it will work in our favor down the road even. I'm not saying that in a utilitarian sense, but just sort of like presenting a coherent approach to the faith.
Correct. Yes.
I remember, I don't know if this was a conversation that we had probably almost a decade ago now, but there was a mission officer from a Catholic hospital who said many medical professionals are drawn to work at the hospital because of the church's commitment to serving the least of these. And so they, for them, even though they might not be Catholic, it's significant that like if someone comes here and they're in need of medical care, it doesn't matter what their socioeconomic status is, we're going to provide them care. She said that in her role, she was drawn into conversations sometimes about like, well, why can't we provide sterilizations or things like this? Procedures that are in direct conflict with Catholic teaching, but are maybe more acceptable at a broadly like social level, speaking in terms of like popular public perception.
Right.
And she would say in those contexts, how for you it's really important that we serve, whether it be like undocumented immigrants or those without health insurance, like on down the line as just a matter of justice. Mm-hmm. Like if we were to punt on this question, how could we then turn around and defend that, right? There's a coherency to what the church teaches and understands its responsibility to be. And that's like we all have to struggle with understanding that in its totality.
Yeah, and this is where, obviously one of the things that will continue to be a big deal in 2026 is technology, artificial intelligence. I sometimes think people need to like tap the brakes, not because I don't think there will be momentous things happening, but because at this point I think it's very clear their marketing departments want us to keep acting like the next AI revolution is just, moments away, and that we should all shudder in fear or excitement, depending on who's doing the marketing. So I want us to resist sort of like the sensationalization of all of that, even though probably people think I'm part of it because I talk about it so much. But I will say this is where it comes to why I think we as the church must talk about it, even if you've decided personally, and I actually think there's plenty of reasons to decide, I will never use artificial intelligence, or I'm going to like turn off my TV, or I'm going to go live in the woods and dance with the elves and play flute. Whatever you choose, the church has to speak on this because it is a reality. And unless it's the case that we decide that all of these technologies are akin to illicit, illegal things like direct abortion, pornography, unless we're willing to say all of this technology, which, Bud, we're currently using on airwaves to be reached by people, and most people are downloading us on podcasts, unless you're willing to condemn it outright and say that it is an illicit thing that should not be done at all, the minute you say that's not the case is the minute the church must be deeply involved in asking all of the questions about what are the eventualities by saying that there is some role of these communication medium technologies in life. Unless you're willing to say that no one should do it ever and that it's intrinsically evil, which most people aren't, funny enough, even the Amish, if you're not going to do that, then we must be involved, even if our involvement is to say far fewer people should do it and use it. And I think that that's hopefully, but a seed that's being planted is 2025 was such a shocking year, I think, for most people. AI, of course, has been roiling about for a couple years, but 2025 really hit the news, people really dealing with the ramifications of it. And it's one more thing where I hope the mystification, or maybe even the punch drunkenness, right, of having the robot hit us in the face, hopefully like our vision is less fuzzy and we can start to go down the road of digital realism and be honest about what the church is calling us to do about it.
Yeah, a phrase that I kept coming back to last year was Jesus' admonition to bring out of the storehouses treasures both old and new. And I mentioned on air before that for me, it's a privilege not only to be on air because of the sort of outreach that we're able to have with listeners, but also when we record, I learn about and get to talk about things that are sort of like new insights for me. And one of the things that really hit me powerfully when we were talking about technology this year is that these sort of pitfalls that we feel like we're up against, these aren't new in the sense like the details are new, but the nature of the beast is not. And, I've learned a lot from you about the impact of the Protestant Revolution on Western history and really like the emergence of the printing press and how that sort of impacted people's experience of the faith. I think the what's called the Counter-Reformation, like the church, of course, had some amazing saints in that context, and the missionary expansion on its own is something that's, was worth celebrating. But we can look back and say that maybe in certain ways the church got drawn too much into sort of like a text-based presentation of the faith. It's inevitable, but you can't really transcend or extract yourself from these technological developments that are taking place. But it's an interesting case study to go back to and think about with digital technologies and now with artificial intelligence, what can we learn from that earlier experience? And I know for myself, like I tend to be sort of an old spirit. And so when I think about even my own children, I'm like, yeah, I mostly want to shield them from these things. And like, it'd be better if my kids didn't have phones or, like with AI, there's so much AI slop. Can we just kind of like sort of bracket this or ignore it as much as possible? But as we've shared in previous episodes, there's also a lot of possibility there. And with really some of the developments that are taking place in the realm of liturgy and how the Mass is celebrated, there's some interesting intersections with like the emergence of digital technologies, how youth have gone back to some earlier devotions and practices, and what that means for how the liturgy is celebrated today. That's not being done perfectly, but it's a fascinating little like laboratory. And I'm interested to see what that means for how the church interacts with AI. And part of it for me, Bo, is even possibly as a foil. Like we're not going to be able to live in this world without intersecting with those technologies in certain ways. On the flip side, it's given me a new appreciation for some of the older treasures that we have. And I've been talking to some students and some of my peers about the value of science, the value of like tangible visual arts and musical arts, etc. And I'm really interested to see sort of what develops there.
Yeah, and I think that as long as it doesn't become like an escapism, I think what you start to see is precisely the new thing really investing new energies in the old. The Counter-Reformation in some ways, Bud, what I would argue, was made through representational art. It's the Catholic world that really seemed to respond to the rise of the printing press with like a new vigor in art, right? I mean, like painting. Painting became, and in ways, what it did is it took some of the storytelling elements of books and sort of imbued them into art where, there's a whole artistic theory that we can get into. But my point is to say, I think that there is that on the horizon for us as well. What are we going to imbue anew with the form, or what we notice that people are seeking when they go to the world of artificial intelligence and digital, but that we imbue it in a new way and allow it to have a second life that, as you said, comes about precisely because these questions were not ignored or ran away from, but seriously dealt with. And that's what these seeds that we're talking about are, not the predicting the future, but thinking about deeply what is it that's going to be the one more time to spur us towards the love of God and neighbor, and that end up being a creative and new thing that none of us could have foretold beforehand. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, thinking about the seeds of what might come up in 2026. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Bud, we're just thinking about seeds and what might grow in 2026. And just a real quick high five to both of us. We didn't mention a sports metaphor once, and there's a lot we could have brought up, and we didn't. We didn't bring up any sports metaphors. I think people should be proud of us.
Well, it wasn't the first time, but we also tried to properly situate the understanding of prophecy and being prophetic. That being said, if folks want my prognostications, I'm happy to give them.
We can do a whole show.
You have to buy me a coffee or maybe even a latte to get those, but I'm definitely happy to meet with you.
Nice.
Oh, and thinking about meeting and sharing and praying, do join us in our prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio. So we have some early morning options. We broadcast the rosary at 4:30 a.m. and then later at 6 a.m. There's a 10:30 rosary, and then 8:30 in the evening. There's the opportunity again. We pray the Chapel of Divine Mercy at 2:57 in the afternoon. But also, I encourage you to jump on the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the rosary anytime, anywhere.
While you're praying, please consider to prayerfully give of your time, talent, and treasure. This place doesn't work except that we have volunteers running around doing so many wonderful things. All of the people praying for Iowa Catholic Radio for 2 decades. But of course, it can't happen without the material support that you give us. Please prayerfully consider to give to Iowa Catholic Radio. You can do so at 515-223-1150 or go online at iowacatholicradio.com and safely and securely donate there. Thank you for being a part of our ministry through your donations. We truly do appreciate it. But as always, looking forward to another year of the Uncommon Good. May 2026 be as interesting, not too interesting, but as interesting as 2025.
Yeah, quick plug. If you missed on January 6th the opportunity to use Blessed Chalk for the devotion in your home, I'm sure your parish priest probably has access to Blessed Chalk still.
Absolutely. It's the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.